Okay, so I'm here to give you a book review of this book. I just finished it right here. I'm here at the Veterans Memorial in San Diego in Balboa Park. And I thought it was a fitting place to sit here and finish this book and talk about it because the book is about the United States going to civil war again. And it's about American refugees who are fleeing from that violence and what life is like for them. So the book, 2 a.m. in Little America, by Ken Kalfus, 2 a.m. in Little America. And the premise is that the United States has fallen into civil war, chaos, unspeakable bloodshed, violence, and horrors of war. And so millions of Americans have fled the country and gone to other countries around the world. And they're increasingly less and less welcome in the countries they get to. There's this growing sense of nationalism and xenophobia in places that they go to. There's a scene where the main character's in one host country and he looks up and sees a plane flying overhead, pulling a banner, and it says, 1 million unemployed is 1 million immigrants too many. I think that's the phrase. So I want to talk about the good, what I liked and didn't like about this book. There's a lot to say about this book. It's a very interesting premise, and the way the author executes it is very interesting. And I think one of the strongest points that it has in its favor is that it can help, especially American readers, reflect on what it's like to be a refugee, what it's like to be a migrant, in a way that might be difficult to some American readers reading a book based in the real world, reading a book based on real life, something like Enrique's Journey by Sonia Nazario, which tells a very real story of a real migrant from Central America, I believe, crossing through Mexico on the freight train. And there are many books like that out there. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of readers in the U.S. who might have a hard time putting themselves in those migrants' shoes, and who might not even pick up a book like that, who might not want to hear what it's like to live as a migrant from Central America or from Sudan or from any place in the world. But I think a book like this, for some readers, it could make it a bit easier to imagine themselves in those shoes, to go into this what-if scenario. What if the United States fell apart, just became this devastated war zone, uninhabitable, and most sensible people just have to flee it, as has happened in so many countries. And so I think this is it's a book that can do that for readers in a way that a lot of books, it might reach a sector of readers that other books cannot. It makes me think of the book that came out a few years ago, American Dirt by Janine Cummings. And it's no secret that I wrote a lot of very negative reviews about that book. I was part of the backlash against that particular book because that book pretended to be about the real-life scenario of migrants in Mexico, but it was just so poorly executed and so unrealistic, and just the author was so terribly uninformed that it became like a caricature of that. And I remember at the time, we're right in the flight path here. This is perfect. Just imagining flights of folks trying to find a new home, a new place to live. At the time of the backlash against the book American Dirt, I remember some reviewers like David Bowles, for instance, the Chicano professor and author. In an interview with NPR, I believe, David Bowles mentioned that Janine Cummings, the fact that she's ill-informed about Mexico and so many things that her book is supposed to be about, doesn't mean she couldn't write a compassionate book about migration. She could have easily just set it in a fictional world or universe or a sci-fi world, futuristic, whatever. And I think that's what Ken Kalfus achieves with this book. I think that's what he manages to pull off with 2 a.m. in Little America. The title comes from, eventually the main character moves to a country that is receiving American refugees. And so he eventually finds a place to live, and it's kind of an enclave of American refugees who move into this neighborhood that they know as Little America. As happens so much with refugees, where they form a community in a host country. And so that's the good of the book. Now, there are some things that didn't work for me in this book. And the biggest issue for me is that The author, he really makes an effort to not specify details. He never names which country the main character is living in, and he doesn't even give you any hints. He's almost being purposefully obtuse about what countries this is supposed to be set in. Even, things like culture and place. It's the way he describes the host countries. It could literally be almost anywhere on Earth. I mean, I'll give you an example from the early on in the book where here we go. Again, here's the book cover. Take another look at it. Wow. So he sets up a date with a young lady, and he asks her to meet him at the Corniche. So the description here, it says he crossed at a traffic light, the 6-lane highway that arced around the city's long, very busy bay. Sandwiched between the road and the beach, the broad, concrete Corniche was the place where the high-strung, hard-working city came to collect its thoughts. Couples and families with small children strolled the boardwalk. Artists set up easels. Vendors sold cold drinks, local and exotic pastries and sweets, and buskers provided entertainment. So it's that kind of description throughout of the cities and the atmospheres. It's just these extremely vague descriptions of where you are, and even of people as well. Pretty soon you realize that the main character, it's narrated in the first person, and the main character, you realize that he suffers from what people know as face blindness, and the official name for it, I had to write it down here, is prosopagnosia. And so that's when you can't tell if you've met someone before. You can't really distinguish one face from another. And you realize that he, early on in the book, no real spoilers here, he has kind of a David and Bathsheba moment where he accidentally stumbles upon seeing a young lady who's bathing in the shower on the roof of a building. And he kind of gets obsessed with her. And he thinks he sees her all around town, and but then he's not sure if it's even her or not. And then this young lady he invites on a date, he thinks it's her, but he's not sure, and the reader's not either. So it's this idea of the unreliable narrator that he really works hard to stick to this unreliable narrator and these very vague descriptions. And I can imagine a few different motives that he might have for doing that. I mean, it might be the idea of trying to create sort of this every man, every place concept to where you can imagine this happening in whatever country or part of the world you want. And it's up to the reader to do that. And the idea is to say that a refugee faces the same plight no matter where they're from and where they're going to. That could be the idea. Even as he describes what this new American Civil War looked like, he talks about two sides. And it's clearly influenced by today's politics and where the lines are drawn, the two sides of the aisle in today's U.S. politics, Team Red and Team Blue. And there are a few little hints where you can kind of guess which side he's referring to, but he only vaguely alludes to them. Eventually, as it turns out, the American conflict bleeds over into the refugee community, and there are some sides that are very political they're interested in reigniting the conflict in this new host country, and so they've formed militias. And this is kind of a cool touch. The militias are formed around different big box stores like Target and other stores, and he never mentions Walmart. I don't think he ever mentions Walmart by name, and so you can sort of, I guess that the Walmart militia is probably the right-wing militia. Just in the popular consciousness, there's this idea of Walmart sort of associated with more conservative places, more red state kind of places. And then there's a militia around Target, which I would assume is more the left-wing militia. But he doesn't give much more specifics than that. So again, here you could think of it as he's trying to get you to see, how stupid war is, how stupid armed conflict usually is, and how nasty it can become, how atrocities can be committed by all sides, no matter how noble their principles may be. I would imagine that could be part of his motivation. I haven't watched any interviews with him. I'll watch those after this video. Maybe the author explains a bit more his motives. But to me, though, it feels too obtuse. The fact that he does that, I found it a little annoying eventually, because what makes a novel, no matter what world it's set in, near future, the real world, sci-fi, what makes it so rich is the detail and the descriptions. And especially a book that is speculative fiction or near future dystopian, like this book is for the US anyway, it's very dystopian. What makes that so rich is the way the author imagines things playing out. Any dystopian novel is really full of the rich detail of that, whether it's 1984, Brave New World, or what I think of more in relation to 2 a.m. in Little America is a book by Gary Steingart. His book is Super Sad True Love Story, and that book is set in the near future in the U.S. in its twilight, where things are starting to fall apart. The U.S. is starting to fall into an authoritarian, dysfunctional state. But he describes it very specifically. He's developed just a new lingo, new slang and fashions, and Steingart, he creates all these new brand names that have very vulgar names for the brands of clothing, and he creates this rich fictional world, which I think that's what this book is missing. And I'd love to hear from the author what his point was in making it so purposefully bland, I guess, purposefully detail-less. But for me, it had the effect of a flattening effect on the narrative, and it just, I get that he probably has a point in doing that, but it made it harder to read and harder to identify with the characters and even just imagine the place where it's happening. And it almost, at some points, he goes to disingenuous points to try to flatten details out. He talks about the two sides in the American conflict, and about Americans having a particular look, and people in the receiving country can spot Americans no matter what. And it's unusual. It almost erases the existence of ethnicity, for instance. And Americans can look a million different ways. This is an extremely diverse country, and even to imagine that a civil conflict could happen here without having an ethnic element, a racial element to it, feels very disingenuous. Feels like a different country than the real country that we're in here. Because clearly any sort of political conflict, many political sides can't stop talking about race and ethnicity in the United States. It's a very front and center issue in folks on many sides in the zeitgeist. So to imagine a whole civil war happening without a racial element, or without certain groups or people from certain regions being more heavily represented in the migration out of the U.S., he sort of just blends it all together. This, pan-American pastiche is the face of these new refugees from the U.S. So that made it a bit harder to believe also. Again, I would really love to hear from the author what his explanation of that motivation is. But it's an interesting book. And I think I could see some people loving or hating this book, or some people feeling like I did, where I had very strong feelings on both sides of it. But it is a book, obviously, I think it's worth talking about, to the point that I recorded this book review of it. So clearly, I think there's something very valuable in there that can contribute to some really rich conversation. And check it out. Again, let's take another look. Apologies for the noise here. I picked this spot because, the whole veteran memorial, speaking of armed conflict, and but there's the parrots are in season. My friend calls them murder birds. These little green parrots are just going nuts up here, and we're in the flight path also. So, but I don't know, I guess that's good for the topic at hand, talking about armed conflict and everything. So, 2 a.m. in Little America. Let's make sure we get the shot right before we end. We'll end on the shot of the front cover. Check it out. A novel by Ken Kalfus.